Shalom, this is Rabbi Josh Rose, and this is Shikul Da'at. Don't count your blessings. Parshat Bo, 57:79. First, let me talk about what I'm not going to talk about in this week's Torah portion. This week's Torah portion is filled with some of the most important moments in the Torah that I'm going to skip right over because I want to focus on something that's easy to read over. But first, let me just say that this week's Torah portion contains the final 3 plagues of locusts, darkness, and death. It also begins the Exodus from Egypt, whose importance cannot be overstated as it is the beginning of our formation as a people and the beginning of our story of redemption and our national relationship to God as a people that leads to our engagement with God at Sinai and our entire journey as a people. But again, I don't want to talk about those things because in our limited time, I want to focus on chapter 12 of this week's Torah portion, which is very interesting and contains a little bit of a hidden secret. It's actually quite an important chapter. In fact, some would say the most important chapter. Let me explain why. But first, let me read it. I'll read it first in Hebrew and then in English. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe ve'el Aharon be'eretz Mitzrayim limor hachodesh hazeh lechem rosh chodeshim rishon hu lechem lechodshei hashana. Which means, God said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, "This month shall be for you the beginning of the months. It shall be for you the first of the months of the year." And then the Torah goes on to describe the Passover offering and the Passover rituals, which are part of our tradition, of course, that we revisit and talk about at Pesach. And so this is in this week's Torah portion that the holiday of Passover is first described and all of the commandments that are associated with it in all of their complexity and detail. But what's striking about this is something that comes from Rabbi Yitzchak. So if we rewind, you don't have to rewind, but I'll tell you, if we rewind all the way back to the very beginning of the Torah and we look at Rashi's, the famous Torah commentator Rashi's very first comment on the entire Torah, he actually tells us that the Torah should have started with the verse that I just read. Well, actually, he quotes Rabbi Yitzchak, who says, from the Talmud, who says that the Torah should have started here. Why is that, says Rabbi Yitzchak? Because this was the first mitzvah that was given to the Jewish people. So imagine that, if you can, when you first open up the Bible, the Torah, and you turn to the book of Genesis, probably most of us, whether or not we are engaged in deep Torah study, can quote the opening line in English at least. "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," which seems like an eminently sensible place for the Torah to begin. But according to Rabbi Yitzchak, it's not necessarily the natural place for the Torah to begin. So how could that be? Imagine opening up the Torah and it begins with, God said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, "This month shall be for you the beginning of the months. It shall be for you the first of the months of the year." So why is it that Rabbi Yitzchak holds that? And why is it that Rashi finds it fitting to place that at the beginning of his commentary on the Torah? Why would the Torah start in chapter 12 of the book of Exodus? I think to understand that question, we have to understand, first of all, that this chapter introduces a fundamental shift in not only a new voice, a new style of language in the Torah, but really a fundamental shift in the Torah's worldview and theological approach. What I mean by that is, up until this moment, where did the Avot, that is, where did the ancestors, and where did the Jewish people, and where did Moses, where did they encounter God? What was the nature of their relationship to God? Well, if we think about all of the stories that we've encountered so far in the magnificent, beautiful narrative that begins in the book of Genesis and goes all the way up until this point, they are spontaneous encounters with God that are based in religious inspiration or based on a sort of surprising engagement of God with an individual when the person is not expecting it. So we think of God calling to Abraham and says, "Leave your land and go to this other land that I will show you." or we think of Jacob's encounters with God through the dreams that he has and God's conversations with him. And we think of Moses wandering at the burning bush and encountering God at that bush, and God engages him in dialogue. Or we think of the Jewish people crying out to God in great pain, and those cries go up to God, and God hears them and pays attention. What we see is in the encounters of God, in the encounters with God up until this point, there is an unmediated experience of the divine. Out in the world, it seems, the Avot, the ancestors, were able to connect to God at various points, sometimes in a way where they anticipated, and sometimes in a way where God comes to them quite by surprise. And these moments of inspiration may be punctuated by periods of silence. For example, God seems to not be so present, at least as a narrative presence, in the story of Joseph. God is very much behind the scenes, but that's a discussion for those parshiot. But then God is also, then God comes back into the story, and the characters speak about God in a different way. But there's no ritualized system for engaging with the divine until this week, until chapter 12. Because when God says this month shall be for you the beginning of the months, it means that we have to start marking the months. And then the Torah continues in verse 3 of the same chapter. God says to Moses, "Speak to the whole community of Israel and say, on the 10th of this month, they," that is the Israelites, "shall take for themselves, each person, a lamb or kid for each father's house, a lamb or kid for the household. But if the household will be too small for a lamb or kid, then he and his neighbor who is near his house shall take according to the number of people. Everyone according to what he eats shall be counted for the lamb or kid. An unblemished lamb or kid, a male, within its first year shall it be for you. From the sheep or the goats shall you take it." I won't go on, but I'm trying to convey to you by reading those several verses that suddenly God presents not only the commemoration of the new month, and not only the commemoration of this grand moment of redemption and freedom, but that it be done in a very particular way in accordance with the precise rules of the Torah. And then we know that the rabbis in the later generations would, through interpretation and through inference and through spiritual genius and creativity, would elaborate on all of these laws and add details to them. But this is brand new, and this chapter 12 leaps out. Leaps out at us because it is so different. And of course, the laws, the specificity of the aspect of worship and how one is to commemorate moments in time and holy spaces, all of that will just increase as we move forward in the Torah. And in a few weeks, we'll get to Parshat Mishpatim, which is almost entirely laws without any narrative. So with that in mind, now let's go back to the original question. How is it that Rabbi Yitzchak thought that the Torah should start with this first mitzvah given to the Jewish people? What is the worldview that reflects? Well, I think that we can say that in asserting that the first mitzvah given to the people should be at the beginning of the Torah, I think what Rabbi Yitzchak and what Rashi are telling us is that this is ultimately the source of meaning in Jewish life. That ultimately creating a reliable structure around us of encounters with God, a web of spiritual meaning and possibilities for an encounter with the divine, is how we invest our lives with meaning and purpose and understanding of ourselves and of how we are to act in the world. And therefore, because of the centrality of the mitzvah to the encounter with God, says Rabbi Yitzchak, it would have been proper to put it at the beginning of the Torah. And by the way, Rabbi Yitzchak then furnishes us with an explanation of why it's not at the beginning of the Torah. It's sort of, he says, even though it should have been there properly, it's for an explanation to the world so the world can understand God's unity and that one God created all things. But let's return to our primary topic, because while Rabbi Yitzchak kind of hints at this an understanding of the magnificence of mitzvah and at the centrality of mitzvah, I want to focus on what is a challenge of this fundamental change. And if we look now at Rashi's comment here in our Torah portion, in Parshat Bo, because again, the Rashi that I shared with you previously was from his comment at the very, very beginning of the Torah. That's actually his first comment on the Torah. Now let's look at Rashi on this chapter 12 that introduces us to this idea that this month shall be for you the beginning of months, and then goes on to talk about the Pesach, that is the Passover. So here is what Rashi says, because I think if we follow his comment, I'll be able to articulate what I think is such a profound challenge for Jewish living. He says on the phrase "this month," which in Hebrew is HaChodesh Hazeh, Rashi says this means renewal. Okay, why does he say renewal? Because Chodesh, moon, is the same word as new. It has the same root as the word new or renewal. HaChodesh Hazeh. So God is saying, this renewal shall be to you the beginning of months. And Rashi says, God showed Moses the moon in its renewal. That is to say, the brand new crescent moon. It's as if God pointed up and said, look at that magnificent sliver of light in the sky. And said to him, Rashi goes on, quoting the Midrash, when the moon renews itself, you will have a new month. So there I want to suggest is the encounter with God in the natural world. Imagine this beautiful moment of Moshe looking up and seeing the moon and realizing that this month is to be commemorated. And what you have is Moses engaging with the natural, created, magnificent, beautiful, beautiful world. And now, though, Rashi goes on. Concerning the month of Nisan, which is what the rabbis understand this month to be in the Torah, God said to him, this shall be the first of the order of the number of the months. So Iyar shall be called the second month, and Sivan shall be called the third month, and so on. And then Rashi goes on. Bear with me, and then I'll circle back and we'll talk about it. Moses found difficulty determining the precise moment of the renewal of the moon. That is, when exactly would it be a new moon? When to mark precisely the emergence of the new moon so that the Jewish people would know when to commemorate it. In what size it should appear before it is fit for recognition or for sanctification. That is, should it just be the slightest line, like maybe I think I see the new moon, or should there be a quarter moon so it can be properly said, and then officially the Jewish people can sanctify it and say, it is the new moon, this is the time, this is the anniversary of our redemption. So how exactly should it appear before the Jewish people mark it and celebrate it? So God showed him with his finger the moon in the sky and said to him, you must see a moon like this and sanctify the month. So what we see from this is that while we begin with this magnificent moment of imagining Moses just taking in the created world as a way to relate to God, we begin with a kind of pure, unmediated awe at the miracle of the moon's light. But then as we read on, and Rashi kind of brings the rabbinic commentary and the rabbinic view of exactly how do we know when it's a new moon, we move to measurement, calculation, demarcation, precision, and a focus on the details. I would say that the source of the halachic, that is the Jewish legal stream, the source of that stream is in the miracle of the created world. But too often our focus is on the practice of the details of the halacha, of the law, and that can lead us away from that life-giving source that is so energizing, that enables us to encounter the divine in the world. And the challenge of the Jewish life is to somehow bring these two worlds together. We need the system of mitzvah to help us understand how it is that the divine can wrap us in this web of meaning and possibility and comfort and guide our lives, so that in some way we have thousands of opportunities to reflect and to meet God throughout the day. Every time we make a blessing, every time we take a step, every time we put on clothes, there's a way that the halakha, that the Jewish law says to do it. Every time we eat food, and there's certain kinds of food that we can eat and we can't. And each one of those moments of decision and understanding and learning from our tradition is an opportunity for growth and encounter. And at the same time, if it removes us from the essence, if we forget and we begin to do the mitzvah just as a mitzvah, and it becomes removed from its source of meaning and possibility and the miracle of God's presence in the created physical world, then we can dry up. And somehow we have to bring these two together. So I want to invite you to continue to learn, to continue to observe, to continue to learn what our ancestors said about the halakha, but also to match that to the passion and to the inspiration that is at the core of our encounter with the divine. Now I want to indulge myself, I want to ask you to indulge me on a completely unrelated note that is very uncharacteristic for this podcast. And I want to say the following. We are at a moment when our president is on the cusp of declaring possibly a national emergency about immigration. And I want to point out how utterly ludicrous and terribly, terribly dangerous it is that we are at this moment. There is absolutely no immigration national emergency. It is a pretext for political posturing, and it is also a way possibly for the president to override the democratic processes that are at the foundation of this country and that have served to protect the citizens of this country, and in particular to protect religious and ethnic minorities who are always in danger when democratic institutions are weakened. And I want to say that not only that, but that the president is lying in the plainest way, saying, just to take one most recent example, that he never claimed that Mexico, that he would demand that Mexico was supposed to play for the wall. It's almost ridiculous to have to say so, but anyone can do research and find out that he plainly stated that Mexico would. I'm less interested, in fact uninterested, on whether on the sources of payment for the wall, and more focused on the rank and very dangerous dishonesty that seems to become second nature to this president and to his defenders. We should all be alarmed that such an issue is being raised to the level of national emergency by those who are trying to raise up the level of hysteria. One simple way that we can know that this is not a national emergency is because over the past years, the immigration problem has been actually moving in a better direction. And in the previous years, when it was much worse, no one was speaking about national emergency. I encourage you to use Google. You can use Google to search over certain years. I did a search for between the year 2000 and the year 2018, and it seems to me on an initial search, no one has ever spoken about a national emergency with regard to immigration. I concede that my research may be a little weak and that I could be wrong on that point, but my larger point stands, and that is, it is reasonable for us to talk about the need for secure borders. It is reasonable for a nation to have a discussion about immigration and how much is too much and how do we regulate that and make sure that it is appropriate. It is not reasonable to take a problem that no one believes is a national emergency and declare it such, and in so doing, threaten the institutions of democracy. I encourage all of us, in whatever way we can, whether we are Democrats or Republicans, whether we are donators to political campaigns or letter writers, or in whatever way, whether we are conservative or liberals, whether we stand on this side or that side of the immigration debate, to use whatever options are in our hand, whatever leverage we have to convey a message to our leaders that we cannot tolerate and they must not tolerate this kind of dangerous, ridiculous, and frightening rhetoric to declare national emergency. May we all have a Shabbat of peace, and may we continue to work towards true security and national unity.